Mom, how are you okay? Like, how are you so normal? The question posed to me in earnest from my elder daughter. It's a question, though, that many of us ask ourselves. How do we, when our grab bag of life's surprises keeps challenging us, retain some semblance of normalcy? Trauma is passed down from generation to generation. And as children, we experience trauma that can stay with us for a lifetime. At the age of 10, my stepfather took his long-term emotional abuse a step further, into sexual abuse. At the age of 11, my biological father, who had been struggling with addiction, had a stroke. At the age of 13, I learned that my mother had breast cancer. And at the age of 14, my mother succumbed to her illness. I was left with a father in recovery and a stepfather with whom I was never safe. These negative events we experience during childhood have a profound impact on who we are and who will we become as adults. They impact our ability to cope, problem solve, and have relationships, among other things. These negative impacts, our grab bag of surprises, tend to stick with us more strongly than those good experiences we have. It is because of this that we often hold on to our trauma. And it is because of this that our trauma may continually play out in our lives. In my case, my surprises, my negative experiences feel numerous. But in that moment, conversing with my daughter, we focused on the two challenges that were devastatingly close together. My father's life-threatening stroke, and shortly thereafter, my mother's breast cancer diagnosis. When I go back to that conversation, I realize that what she was really asking me was, how are you so resilient? The reason I focus on resilience instead of normalcy is because normalcy can be abundant on any plane of existence. Even destructive things become normal after long periods of time. The concept of normalcy itself is overwhelmingly open-ended, vague, and restrictive all at the same time. And so today, I'm going to further explore this idea of resilience in the face of trauma, because it is truly resilience that allows us to live a quote-unquote normal life. As time goes by, our traumas tend to shape us less and less explicitly. They become intrinsic, hidden in motives or idiosyncrasies. They become a normal part of our fabric. Over much time of reflection, I have realized that the death of my mother has not only defined me as a person, which is an obvious action and reaction, but the absence of a mother and the trauma suffered because of it has most especially defined me as a mother myself. So, what does resilience look like? When we talk about resilience, perhaps a person comes to mind, or a pivotal event that we overcame. But for those of us who have endured difficulties and challenges, likely none of us would visualize it as a straight line, a prairie highway stretching directly to its destination. Resilience is not, in fact, a destination. Resilience is more like a winding road, a circular event, a roller coaster. Like the ride, there are moments when we're cruising upward, feeling free and easy. There are moments when we are poised at the top, unsure of when the downward plunge will come. And there are moments when we're hurtling toward the ground with our stomachs in our throats. There are moments when life is throwing us through loop after unrelenting loop. On a roller coaster, we can feel safe in knowing that the ride will end and we will emerge unscathed. But the cycle of resilience doesn't necessarily end. We never stop needing resilience. As time goes by, our traumas tend to shape us less and less explicitly. And so when we move forward, we have to realize that there are some acts of resilience that we can exercise in our lives. Because that trauma becomes a deep part of who we are, we need to change the way we think. So there are acts of resilience that we can exercise in our lives that are what I call trauma-informed living, as opposed to trauma-controlled living. Trauma-informed living means that we recognize and understand that our trauma really does inform our choices. And that knowledge leads us to a healthier and more balanced life. Trauma-controlled living is simply that our trauma controls our choices. The need for acts of resilience has felt never-ending in my life. I really should be a statistic. My childhood experiences are just the tip of the iceberg. My roller coaster as a youth looked like loops within loops within loops, broken intermittently by sheer downward plunges. For some reason, my resilience has always remained constant. Some points in my life when my resilience has been more prevalent, but it has always been there. On my roller coaster, I can look back on my life and realize that for many years, my trauma was running my life instead of me running it. I have some acts of resilience that helped pull me out of those cycles. So how? First, and arguably the most important, is the ability to see oneself. For some reason, I'm a naturally reflective person. Perhaps that's a part of my innate introversion. Perhaps it's because I spent much of my childhood unsafe, and so I had to retreat into myself as the only safe place. Either way, the most important thing that I can explain to you is how my own true self-reflection worked. You see, we all want to be the heroes of our own stories. And so, when we look in the proverbial mirror, we don't always acknowledge the truth that we see. We either sugarcoat our souls with excuses, or we deviate into self-deprecation and self-loathing. For a time, I played the victim. I played the victim well. It was my normal. The way I was able to stop living in this cycle was to take a hard, truthful look at myself. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw the good, the bad, the broken. I saw that my major life decisions were being influenced by the fear that I wouldn't ever escape my trauma. And ironically, it was this fear that kept me in destructive cycles. Knowing this, I realized that the death of my mother has shaped who I would become inexorably. My life has often mirrored the life of my mother, and I can see that actually her own trauma informed the way she raised me. As I grow older and learn more about her as a human being, I learn more about her difficulties. And I see those projected onto me as a child in the ways she taught and raised me. I know my mother spent a great deal of her life in her own cycles of fear and pain. We pass these cycles down like they are hereditary diseases. We transmit them to our offspring in such a way that we don't often realize we're doing it. I've done this myself without even seeing it. Because trauma is recycled constantly, my experiences have influenced the majority of the decisions that I have made in my life. And I dare say, these things will always influence me. While the influence may always be there, being trauma-informed can help me exercise my acts of resilience and reflection, and I can catch myself from passing it on. Self-reflection can start you on the path, but can't take you all the way. After you reflect, you need to be willing to do the work your soul needs to heal and break the cycles. For me, sometimes that work looks like forgiving myself for things that I regret and choosing to walk forward instead of sliding into self-loathing. Forgiveness of oneself is a choice. Sometimes, when life is particularly hard, I need to exercise these acts of reflection and forgiveness daily and deliberately. I need to make time to have a conversation with myself, examine, forgive, and move forward. The last tool that I have most recently discovered that is an amazing breaker of cycles is transparency and honesty with those who depend on me. My mother was an enigma to me. I didn't understand her, had no idea why she was so hard sometimes, didn't understand why she made the choices she did. Knowing this, I realized that I can't be a mystery to my daughters. If they can understand the work I am doing on myself, understand how I'm working hard to break cycles, then they can also understand how resilience can work in their own lives, thus calling attention to their own cycles. In this way, I begin to push my resilience outward into the world. Ultimately, my resilience grew through my experiences and seeing others do their own healing work, like my father in his recovery. By virtue of struggling, I gained strength. Each one of us in this room today has endured or is enduring, and we all know someone who is. And that individual knowledge can now translate into collective empathy. My sense of self and deliberate healing practice leads to an ability to be patient with others and adds to a pool of community resilience. The work we do on ourselves does not stop with us. Actually, it returns to us through the health and stability of our children, of our friends, of our coworkers. Instead of passing around our trauma, we can live out and pass around our resilience. Let's emanate resilience instead of trauma from here on out, because it is learned through micro experiences, observation, and evolution. Every single one of us in this room today can create a new cycle. You can and do cycle and recycle your resilience. Resilience is a superpower we all possess, yet rarely disclose. Let's not keep it to ourselves. I could have been a statistic, but because of my experiences and others doing their own work of resilience around me, I am not. Our acts of resilience can become our normal. And the wonderful thing is, we all have the ability to exercise acts of resilience. You, me, and every one of us.